Joining us now, national security expert and a contributing writer at The Atlantic, Tom Nichols, and retired Lieutenant General Ben Hodges. He's a former commanding general of the U.S. Army in Europe, and now the Pershing Chair in Strategic Studies at the Center for European Policy Analysis. Thank you very much.
General, let's go to you first before this conversation devolves into a debate with Nichols and me over Led Zeppelin in Boston. Instead of looking back, let's look forward and talk about what the history of Russia looks like after these past 6, I would just say, disastrous weeks for Russia on just about every front, militarily, economically, culturally, technologically. What's it look like?
Joe, as I have been looking at this for the last several weeks, and 2 days ago, it really hit me. I looked at the map and saw that red sliver of Ukraine that the Russians have taken after 8 weeks of fighting. That's all they've been able to accomplish. And I think that we are seeing the beginning, maybe, or we're on the front edge of the collapse of the Russian Federation as a state within the next 4 or 5 years. They've got everything they have involved in this fight, and they cannot defeat Ukraine. The corruption inside the ministry, inside the government, is becoming more and more evident. I'm here in Istanbul. Yesterday, I saw the personal yacht of former President Medvedev was heading north back to Sochi. The Russian people are not going to put up with this forever, and I do think that the sanctions are really going to be taking effect over the next few months. Europe is eventually moving away from carbon-based fuel. I don't see a very bright future for a Putin-led government.
You know, Tom, you and I, of course, grew up. Our view of the world was shaped by the Cold War. We remember, of course, the 80s. It seemed in the early to mid 80s, the Cold War seemed to be at its height with Ronald Reagan. We had no idea. I mean, we were blindsided by the events of 1989 and again 1991. But this corruption, this ineptitude, this just rotted out military and economy, it is laid bare for all the world to see. I'm wondering what your assessment is, if you agree with the general, that the next 4 to 5 years are going to be extraordinarily difficult for Russia.
Oh, they're going to be extraordinarily difficult. I don't know about the collapse of the Russian state, but it could be the collapse of the Putin regime. No Russian leader has done this much damage to Russia in so short a time. I mean, it's remarkable the amount of damage Putin's inflicted on his own country in just 5 or 6 weeks. He's set his economy back 20 years, 15, 20 years. It'll take several years for them to recover from this, which will always be difficult as long as Putin's in power. If current trends with NATO continue, not only will he pay the price for trying to keep Ukraine out of NATO, which wasn't going to happen anytime soon, but NATO could end up having 32 countries, including Finland and Sweden, which is a Russian nightmare scenario. I mean, it's a remarkable combination of hubris and utter ineptitude, and it reminds me of the Hemingway character talking about going bankrupt, that how do you go bankrupt? Suddenly, gradually, and then suddenly. So, you know, that's how regimes collapse as well, gradually and then suddenly. I think Putin has somewhat more staying power, at least in the short term, than we might give him credit for. His grip on power is very strong. But, you know, the Russian state, just as happened in the late Soviet period, Joe, when you were talking about the 80s, I'm sure there are people inside Moscow saying, we can't go on this way.
General Hodges, I'm curious, as someone who's commanded troops in Europe, what you make of Vladimir Putin's focus on Mariupol. Obviously, it's a strategic coastal city. It gets him down into Crimea and all the things that we've talked about for several weeks now. But his struggle to take it, he's claimed victory there now. What you think happens to that holdout regiment and those civilians inside the steel factory, and what you learned watching the Russian military operate there?
Thanks, Willie. You know, the Battle of Stalingrad in World War II, it became very personal, both for Hitler and Stalin, fighting over this city. And tens of thousands of soldiers on both sides, as well as civilians, died fighting in this city that had taken on such a personal meaning for leaders on both sides. I think Mariupol represents that a little bit for President Putin. Secondly, it is very clear that Russia has zero interest in protecting infrastructure inside Ukraine, because one of the objectives of this entire war is to eliminate Ukraine as a state, or even the idea of a Ukrainian state. So making sure that there is no possibility of economic recovery. Mariupol, of course, very important as one of the ports for exporting grain and so on. So this is all about, which is why they're going to try and declare victory here on the 9th of May, that they have wrecked Ukraine's economy and isolated it from the Azov Sea. The third thing is I think we're all going to be studying or talking about Mariupol and the defenders of Mariupol in the same sort of heroic way people talk about the Spartans or other famous battles like that. It's not going to be good if the Russians, and I'm still not convinced they will, if they are ever able to finally capture what's left of the garrison of the soldiers there. They're not going to be treated well. There's no doubt about that.
So General, on that score, with reference to the people, to the Ukrainians, the army holding out in Mariupol, it appears to us each day as we look at the maps, we look at the lack of progress that the Russians are making and the slow progress that they sometimes make, that it's basically an army of conscripts, not a lot of NCOs out there in the field with those conscripts. Could you please talk about something that is hard to define for most people? I'm sure you can define it. The difference in the willingness to fight on both sides.
Mike, thank you. You know, there's a famous quotation from Napoleon. He says, the moral is to the physical as 3 is to 1. In other words, you may have all the newest equipment, you may have the most stuff, but it's the moral component, the human dimension of warfare that ultimately makes the day. That's why history is so full of examples of people that were outnumbered still overcoming their adversaries. And that's what we've seen in plain view with Ukraine. A very decentralized fight, by the way. It's not one person sitting in a bunker in Kyiv calling the shots at all these fights going around the periphery. It's a very decentralized system with colonels and majors and captains in command versus multiple generals, which is the opposite of the Russian system. This is enabled somewhat by the creation, the development of a corps of non-commissioned officers, sergeants, that Ukrainians have developed because of their association with Western armies, with the U.S. Army and the U.S. Marine Corps over the past 2 decades. And the sergeants are what connect the army to the people. I mean, not many people know a general, but everybody knows a sergeant somewhere in their family. And when you don't have that in a conscript army, you don't have this powerful connection about what you're fighting for.
Yeah, you know, Tom, we talked about 1989 a few minutes ago, and we never saw the sudden collapse of the Iron Curtain coming. And I yet to talk to a military analyst. I've yet to talk to anybody in government that could have predicted just how bad, just how corrupt, just how rotten to its core Russia's military is, and how poorly they've performed over the past 6-7 weeks. First of all, why didn't we see this coming? And secondly, what is at the core of Russia's problem? This was supposed to be Putin's grand project over the past 12 years since Georgia, 14 years since Georgia, to rebuild the military. How could he have failed so completely?
Well, on the first point, we didn't see it coming, I think, because the Soviet military was better than this. That's not saying very much, but it was a much better military than the one we're seeing in Russia now. But the core problem for Russia is the problem that all authoritarian states have, which is that authoritarian militaries run by dictatorships that dragoon guys into the military. You know, a lot of these, General Hodges knows as well, a lot of these are not ethnic Russians. They are Russian citizens, but they've been pulled in from other parts of Russia, you know, basically rural kids from non-Russian parts of Russia, and thrown into this fight that they don't understand. Authoritarian militaries just don't fight very well. They're not good at taking initiative. They're not good at trusting their soldiers to make decisions. One of the reasons you're seeing so many generals get whacked is that because this kind of military is incapable of independent thinking, they always have to send a general up to the front to go unscrew whatever problem seems to be holding everybody up, because nobody will take initiative. The officers hate the enlisted men. The enlisted men hate the officers. The generals hate everybody. There is no cooperative relationship. I was thinking of what General Hodges was saying about the NCOs. What strikes me, and I taught military officers for 25 years, what strikes me are the really firm bonds that go from the lower enlisted ranks through the NCOs to the junior officers all the way up to the senior command. The Russians don't have that. The Russians are a military that is highly centralized and governed by fear of screwing up. And when you are constantly afraid of screwing up, instead of taking initiative, you end up with two outcomes. One is that a bunch of your guys get killed, and the other is that the only solution you have for everything is to pound it into the dust, because that's the only safe answer. And so, we all expected the Russians, I think, to not be as great as they build themselves. But, even I and others who study the Russian military, I don't think we were prepared for this level of staggering incompetence that we're seeing now.